Okay, so I'm reading from Science and Sanity in an introduction to non-Aristotelian systems and general semantics by Alfred Korzybski, and we are on book 2, page 386, on the structural differential. Okay. So chapter 25 on the structural differential. You cannot recognize an event, because when it is gone, it is gone. But a character of an event can be recognized. Things which we thus recognize, I call objects. A. N. Whitehead. When there is a judgment of identity or difference, it is because a particular associative reaction of the second order is occurring, conditioned by the primary reaction, whether the same or different. This is a gain in perceptive knowledge. Henry Piron. To some extent, the practice of thinking, deciding, feeling, appreciating, and sympathizing molds the personality of the thinker. Presumably, the stable patterns of cortical association are changed by the performance of these acts, just as on a lower plane, muscles are changed by systematic exercises. See Judson Herrick. Experimental analysis of the memory of forms insusceptible of symbolic schematization has convinced me of the great importance of ocular kinesthesia and the small part played by visualization in nearly all individuals, with the general illusion of really visual representations, a very strong illusion, especially when symbolic and verbal schematization is possible. Ideas which are substituted for visual representation and play the same part are easily mistaken for it. Henry Piron. The eyes of the dog give to him sometimes a more intelligent expression than that of his master, and there is no doubt that he uses them to good advantage. But they are not our eyes. See Judson Herrick. Before I recapitulate in the form of a structural diagram what has been said in the previous chapter, I must explain briefly the use of the term event. The introduction of new terms in a language always represents initial difficulties to the student. It is always advisable, if only possible, to introduce terms which are structurally close to our daily experience. At present, in physics, we have a dual language, one of space-time, in which matter is connected somehow with its curvature, and other of the quanta. The structure of both languages is quite different, and at present scientists have not succeeded in translating one language into the other. Einstein, in his latest unified field theory, has succeeded, by the introduction of new notions, in amalgamating the electromagnetic phenomena with the general theory of relativity, but even this new language does not include the quantum theory. For my purpose, it is important to amalgamate both languages as an intuitive pictorial device, which, from a technical point of view, still awaits formulation. As the space-time continuum is the closest to our daily experience, I accept the language of events as fundamental and add only a few pictorial notions taken from the quantum theory. There is no doubt that the day is not far off when the unified field theory will be extended to include the new quantum theory, and so this anticipation does not appear illegitimate. If we take anything, let us say the object already referred to called pencil, and inquire what it represents, according to Science 1933, we find that the scientific object represents an event, a mad dance of electrons, which is different every instance, which never repeats itself, which is known to consist of extremely complex dynamic processes of very fine structure acted upon by the reacting upon the rest of the universe, inextricably connected with everything else and dependent on everything else. If we inquire how many characteristics we should ascribe to such an event, the only possible answer is that we should ascribe to an event infinite numbers of characteristics, as it represents a process which never stops in one form or another. Neither, to the best of our knowledge, does it repeat itself. 1 second. MO is multi-ordinal, by the way. In our diagram, figure 1, we indicate this by a parabola A, which is supposed to extend indefinitely, which extension we indicate by a broken off line, B. We symbolize the characteristics by small circles, C, the number of which is obviously indefinitely great. Underneath, we symbolize the object by the circle O, which has a finite size. The characteristics of the object we also denote by similar little circles, C apostrophe. The number of characteristics which an object has is large but finite, and is denoted by the finite number of the small circles, C apostrophe. Then we attach a label to the object, its name, let us say pencil 1, which we indicate in our diagram by the label L. We ascribe also characteristics to the label, and we indicate these characteristics by little circles, C apostrophe apostrophe. The number of characteristics, which we ascribe by definition to the label, is smaller than the number of characteristics the object has. To the label pencil 1, we would ascribe perhaps its length, thickness, shape, color, hardness, but we would mostly disregard the accidental characteristics, such as a scratch on its surface or the kind of glue by which the two wooden parts of the objective pencil are held together. If we want an objective pencil and come to a shop to purchase one, we say so and specify verbally only these characteristics which are of particular immediate interest to us. It is clear that the object is often of interest to us for some special characteristics of immediate usefulness or value. If we inquire as to the neurological processes involved in registering the object, we find that the nervous system has abstracted from the infinite number of submicroscopic characteristics of the event a large but finite number of macroscopic characteristics. In purchasing a pencil, we usually are not interested in its smell or taste. But if we were interested in these abstractions, we would have to find the smell and taste of our object by experiment. But this is not all. The object represents in this language a gross macroscopic abstraction, for our nervous system is not adapted for the abstracting directly the infinite numbers of characteristics which the endlessly complex dynamic fine structure of the event represents. We must consider the object as a first abstraction with a finite number of characteristics from the infinite numbers of characteristics an event has. The above considerations are in perfect accord not only with the functioning of the nervous system but also with its structure. Our nervous system registers objects with its lower centers first, and each of these lower specific abstractions we call an object. If we were to define an object, we should have to say that an object represents a first abstraction with a finite number of multi-ordinal characteristics from the infinite number of multi-ordinal characteristics an event has. Obviously, if our inspection of the object is through the lower nervous centers, the number of characteristics which the object has is larger, taste, smell of our pencil 1, than the number of characteristics which we need to ascribe to the label. The label, the importance of which lies in its meaning to us, represents a still higher abstraction from the event and usually labels also a semantic reaction. We have come to some quite obvious and most important structural conclusions of evaluation of the non-elementalistic type. We see that the object is not the event but an abstraction from it, and that the label is not the object nor the event but a still further abstraction. The nervous processes of abstracting we represent by the lines N and N apostrophe. The characteristics left out or not abstracted are indicated by the lines B apostrophe, B apostrophe, apostrophe. For our semantic purpose, the distinction between lower and higher abstractions seems fundamental, but of course, we could call the object simply the first order abstraction, and the label with its meanings the second order abstraction, as indicated in the diagram. If we were to inquire how this problem of abstracting in different orders appears as a limiting case among animals, we would select a definite individual with which to carry on the analysis. For our analysis, which is deliberately of an extensional character, we select an animal with a definite proper name corresponding to Smith among us. Such an animal suggests itself at once on purely verbal grounds. It is the one we call Fido. Practically all English-speaking people are acquainted with the name Fido because most of us like dogs and are aware of how intelligent they are. Investigations and experimenting have shown that the nervous system of a Fido presents, in structure and function, marked similarities to that of a Smith. Accordingly, we may assume that in a general way, it functions similarly. We have already spoken of the event in terms of recognition, namely that we can never recognize an event as it changes continually. Whitehead points out the fundamental difference between an event and an object in terms of recognition, namely that an event cannot be recognized and that an object can be recognized. He defines the object as the recognizable part of the event. The use of this definition helps us to test whether Fido has objects. Since experiments show that Fido can recognize, we have to ascribe to Fido objects by definition. If we inquire what the objects of Fido represent, the structure and function of his nervous system, which are very similar to ours, would suggest that Fido's objects represent also abstractions of some low order from the events. Would his objects appear the same as ours? No. First of all, the abstractions from events which we call objects are not the same, even when abstracted by different individuals among humans. An extreme example of this can be given in that limited form of color blindness, which is called daltonism, when an object which appears green to most persons appears red to the certain few who suffer from this disease. There is at present no doubt that the nervous abstractions of all organisms are individual, not only with each individual, but at different times with one individual, and differ also for these higher groups abstractions, which we call species. We can infer how the world appears to a particular organism only if its nervous structure is quite similar to our own. With species widely separated neurologically, such inferences are entirely unjustified. So, on general grounds, the objects of Fido are not the same as ours. On neurological grounds, they appear only similar. In daily experience, we know that we should have difficulty in recognizing our own glove among 1,000, but Fido could perform this detection for us much better. So the same glove must have been registered in the nervous system of Fido differently from the way it has been in ours. We indicate this similarity of the human object, OH, and the animal object, OA, by making the circle OA smaller and emphasize the difference between the objects by differently spacing the holes representing the characteristics. Whether we call the objects OH and OA first order abstractions or 100th order abstractions or simply lower order abstractions is mainly optional. There is no neurological doubt that all objects represent low order abstractions, and the use of a number to indicate the order is simply a matter of convention and convenience. If we were to start with the simplest living cell, we might ascribe to its abstractions the term first-order abstractions. If we were to survive in this way all known forms of life, we might ascribe to Fido and Smith very large numbers as their orders of abstractions. But this is unnecessary, as we shall presently see. We note that Fido does abstract from events, at any rate in lower orders, has objects, OA, which he can recognize. The question is, does he abstract in higher orders? We might answer that he does within certain limits, or we might prefer to take the limits of his abstracting capacities for granted and to include them all as lower order abstractions. For the sake of convenience and simplicity, we select the last method and say that he does not abstract in higher orders. In our schematic representation, we shall discover some very important differences between the abstracting capacities of human and animals, and so we introduce here only as much complexity as we need. As animals have no speech in the human sense, and as we have called the verbal labeling of the object second-order abstraction, we say that animals do not abstract in higher orders. Footnote to that sentence. In the present system, the terms labeling are always connected with their meaning, and so for simplicity, from now on, the reference to meanings will be omitted. If we compare our diagram and what it represents with the well-known facts of daily life, we see that Smith's abstracting capacities are not limited to 2 orders or to the n orders of abstractions. In our diagram, the label L stands for the name which we assigned to the object, but we can also consider the level of the first label L as a descriptive level or statement. We know very well that Smith can always say something about a statement L on record. Neurologically considered, this next statement, L1, about a statement L, would be the nervous response to the former statement L, which has seen or heard or even produced by himself inside his skin. So his statement L1 about the former statement L is a new abstraction from the former abstraction. In my language, I call it an abstraction of a higher order. In this case, we shall be helped by the use of numbers. If we call the level L an abstraction of second order, we must call an abstraction from this abstraction an abstraction of third order, L1. Once an abstraction of third order has been produced, it becomes, in turn, a fact on record, potentially a stimulus, and can be abstracted further and a statement made about it, which becomes an abstraction of the fourth order, L2. This process has no definite limits, for whenever statements of any order are made, we can always make a statement about them, and so produce an abstraction of still higher order. This capacity is practically universal among organisms, which we call humans. Here we reach a fundamental difference between Smith and Fido. Fido's power of abstracting stops somewhere, although it may include a few orders. Not so with Smith. His power of abstracting has no known limit. Perhaps the reader is semantically perplexed by the unfamiliarity of the language of this analysis. It must be granted that the introduction of any new language is generally perplexing, and it is justified only if the new language accomplishes something structurally and semantically which the old languages did not accomplish. In this case, it has brought us to a new sharp distinction between man and animal. The number of orders of abstractions an animal can produce is limited. The number of orders of abstractions a man can produce is, in principle, unlimited. Here is found the fundamental mechanism of the time-binding power which characterizes man and which allows him, in principle, to gather the experiences of all past generations. A higher order abstraction, let us say, of the n+1 order, is made as a response to the stimulus of abstractions of the nth order. Among humans, the abstractions of high orders produced by others, as well as those produced by oneself, are stimuli to abstracting in still higher orders. Thus, in principle, we start where the former generation left off. It should be noticed that in the present analysis, we have abandoned the structurally elementalistic methods and language, and the whole analysis becomes simple, although non-familiar, because it involves new non-elementalistic semantic reactions. The preceding explanation justifies my former statement that the ascribing of absolute numbers to the orders of abstractions of animal and of man is unnecessary. In our diagram, we could ascribe as many orders of abstractions to the animals as we please, yet we should have to admit for the structural correctness of description of experimental facts that the animal's power of abstracting has limits, while the number of orders of abstractions of a man can produce has no known limits. For an epistemological and semantic point of view, there is an important benefit in this method. In this language, we have discovered sharp verbal and analytical methods in terms of the non-elementalistic orders of abstractions by which these two classes of life, or these two high abstractions, can be differentiated. The terms animal and man each represent a name for an abstraction of very high order, and not a name for an objective individual. To formulate the difference between these classes becomes a problem of verbal, structural ingenuity and methods. As in life, we deal only with absolute individuals on the unspeakable objective levels. In our diagram, we could hang on the animal object as many levels of labels which stand for higher order abstractions as we please, yet somewhere we would have to stop. But the man we could continue indefinitely. This sharp difference between man and animal may be called the horizontal difference. The habitual use of our hands in showing these differential horizontal levels is extremely useful in studying this work, and it facilitates greatly the acquiring of the structurally new language and corresponding semantic reaction. The solution of the majority of human semantic difficulties, evaluation, and the elimination of pathological identification lie precisely in the maintenance, without confusion, of the sharp differentiation between these horizontal levels of orders of abstractions. Let us now investigate the possibility of a sharp vertical difference. We have already come to the conclusion that Fido abstracts objects from events, and that if his nervous system is similar to ours, his lower order abstractions are similar to ours. Here we may ask the question, does Fido know, or can he know, that he abstracts? It seems undeniable that Fido does not know and cannot know that he abstracts, because it takes science to know that we abstract, and Fido has no science. It is semantically important that we should be entirely convinced on this point. We do not argue about the kind of knowledge animals may have, or about the relative value of this knowledge as compared with ours. Science was made possible by the human nervous system and the invention of extraneural means for investigation and recording, which animals lack entirely. Whoever claims that animals have science should, to say the least, show libraries and scientific laboratories and instruments produced by animals. We see that, although Fido has abstracted, he not only does not know, but cannot know that he abstracts, as this last knowledge is given exclusively by science, which animals do not have. In this consciousness of abstracting, we find a most important vertical difference between Smith and Fido. The difference is sharp again. If in our diagram, figure 4, we ascribe to Fido some horizontal orders of abstractions, let us say to H1 and H2, nevertheless the animal stops somewhere. This extended diagram illustrates that man is capable of abstracting in higher and higher orders indefinitely. In this diagram, we symbolize the fact that Fido does not and cannot know that he abstracts by not connecting the characteristics of his object O, A by the lines A, N with the event E. Without science, we have no event. Fido's gross macroscopic object OA represents all that he knows or cares about. We see that the vertical difference V1, formulated as consciousness of abstracting for Smith, appears sharp and completely differentiates Fido from Smith. In it, we find the semantic mechanism of all proper evaluation based on non-identification or the differentiation between orders of abstractions impossible with animals. In this diagram, we have introduced more objects because each individual abstracts in general from an event different objects in the sense that they are not identical in every respect. We must be aware continuously that in life, on the unspeakable objective level, we deal only with absolute individuals, be they objects, situations, or semantic reactions. The vertical stratification not only gives us representation for the sharp difference between man and animal, but also allows us to train our semantic reaction in the absolute individuality of our objects and those of different observers, and for the differences between their individual abstractions. What has been said here applies equally to all first-order effects on the objective level, such as immediate feelings. The present theory can only be fully beneficial when the reader acquires in his system the habitual feeling of both the vertical and the horizontal stratifications, with which identification becomes impossible. In the experiments of Dr. Philip S. Graven with the mentally ill, training in the realization of his stratification has either resulted in complete recovery or has markedly improved the conditions of the patient. The diagram is used in two distinct ways. One is by showing the abstracting from the event to the object and the applying of a name to the object. The other is by illustrating the level of statements which can be made about statements. If we have different objects and label them with different names, say A1, A2, A3, so on to AN, we still have no proposition. To make a proposition, we have to accept some undefined relational term by which we relate one object to the other. The use of this diagram to illustrate the levels of orders of statements implies that we have selected some metaphysics as expressed in our undefined relational terms. We should be fully aware of the difference between these two uses of the one diagram for the structural illustration of two aspects of one process. If we inquire, what do the characteristics of the event represent? We find that they are given only by science and represent at each date the highest, most verified, most reliable abstractions Smith has produced. Theory and practice have shown that the points illustrated by the above structural diagrams have a crucial semantic significance, as without using them, it is practically impossible to train ourselves or others and to accomplish the psychophysiological re-education. For this reason, the diagrams have been produced for home and school use separately in the simplified form illustrated in Figure 5. This structural diagram is called the anthropometer, or the structural differential, as it illustrates the fundamental structural difference between the world and so the environment of the animal and man. If we live in such a very complex human world, but our semantic reaction, owing to wrong evaluation, are adjusted only to the simpler animal world, free, to say the least, from man-made complications, then adjustment and sanity for humans is impossible. Our semantic reactions are bound to follow the simpler animalistic patterns pathological for man. All human experience, scientific or otherwise, shows that we still copy animals in our nervous reactions, trying to adjust ourselves to a world of fictitious, simple animal structure, while actually we live in a world of a very complex human structure, which is quite different. Naturally, under such conditions, which ultimately turn out to be delusional, human adjustment is impossible and results in false evaluations, animalistic semantic reactions, and the general state of insanity. Anyone who will work out the present analysis with the aid of the differential will find clearly that the majority of human difficulties, the preventable or curable mental or semantic disturbances included, are due to this fatal structural error, resulting in false evaluation due to identification or lack of differentiation. The structural differentials are manufactured in two forms. One, in a printed map-like scroll for hanging on the walls or a blackboard. Two, in relief form with detachable labels, as the main problem is to train and re-educate the semantic psychophysiological reactions in non-identity. The relief form is the most effective because of the freely hanging strings detachable labels, which give means to engage more nerve centers in the training. I shall describe the latter type in some detail. For the event, we have a parabola in relief, E, broken off to indicate its limitless extension. The disk OH symbolizes the human object. The disk OA represents the animal object. The label L represents the higher abstraction called a name, with its with its meaning given by a definition. The lines AN in the relief diagram are hanging strings which are tied to pegs. They indicate the process of abstracting. The free hanging strings BN indicate the most important characteristic left out, neglected, or forgotten in the abstracting. The structural differentials are provided with a number of separate labels attached to pegs. These are hung one to the other in a series, and the last one may be attached by a long peg to the event to indicate that the characteristics of the event represent the highest abstractions we have produced at each date. The objective level is not words and cannot be reached by words alone. We must point our finger and be silent, or we shall never reach this level. Our personal feelings also are not words and belong to the objective level. The whole of the present theory can be illustrated on the structural differential by the childishly simple operation of the teacher pointing a finger to the event and then to the object, saying, "This is not this," and insisting on silence on the pupil's part. One should continue by showing with the finger the object and the label, saying again, "This is not this," insisting on silence on the objective level, then showing the first and the second label, saying again, "This is not this." In a more complex language, one would say that the object is not the event, that the label is not the unspeakable object, and that a statement about a statement is not the same statement, nor on one level. We see and are made to visualize that the non-Aristotelian system is based on the denial of the is of identity, which necessitates the differentiation of orders of abstractions. The little word to be appears as a very peculiar word and is perhaps responsible for many human semantic difficulties. If the anthropologists are correct, only a few of the primitive peoples have this verb. The majority do not have it and do not need it because all their semantic reactions and languages are practically based on and involve literal identification. In passing from the primitive stage of human society to the present slightly higher stage, which might be called the infantile stage or infantile period, too crude identification was no longer possible. Languages were built based on slightly modified or limited identification, and for flexibility, the is of identity was introduced explicitly, although very little has been done in the structural analysis of languages in general, and of those of primitive peoples in particular. We know that in the Indo-European languages, the verb to be, among others, is used as an auxiliary verb and also for the purpose of positing false to facts identity. With the primitive prevalent lack of consciousness of abstracting and the primitive belief in the magic of words, the semantic reactions were such that words were identified with the objective levels. Perhaps it is not too much to say that the primitive psychology peculiarly required such a fundamental identity. Identity may be defined as absolute sameness in all respects, which, in a world of ever-changing processes and a human world of indefinitely many orders of abstractions appears as a structural impossibility. Identity appears then as a primitive over-emotional generalization of similarity, equality, equivalence, equipollence, and in no case does it appear in fact as absolute sameness in all respects. As soon as the structurally delusional character of identity is pointed out, it becomes imperative for sanity to eliminate such delusional factors from our languages and semantic reactions. With the advent of civilization, the use of this word was enlarged, but some of the fundamental primitive implications and psychological semantic effects were preserved. If we use the is at all, and it is extremely difficult to avoid entirely this auxiliary verb when using languages which to a large extent depend on it, we must be particularly careful not to use is as an identity term. In 1933, the amount of knowledge we have about the primitive peoples is considerable. Anthropologists have gathered an enormous number of descriptive facts on which they practically all agree, but the several schools of anthropology differ widely as to the interpretation of these facts. Roughly speaking, the British school tries to interpret the facts from the point of view of ascribing to the primitives the deficient psychology and logic of the white man. The French and Polish schools avoid these unjustified tendencies and attempt to reconstruct the original primitive psychologies and logics which could be responsible for the developments or the lack of developments of the primitive peoples. All schools, except as yet the existing elementalistic psychologies and too valued Aristotelian logic as the standard normal and perhaps even as the final disciplines for an adult human civilization. No school suspects that an Aristotelian stage of civilization appears to be built to a large extent on the slightly refined primitive identifications which produced only an infantile period of human development. They do not suspect that a future non-Aristotelian society may differ as greatly from the present Aristotelian society as the latter differs from the primitive society. In my work, I prefer to follow the French and Polish schools of anthropology, as it seems to me that these schools are freer from semantic identification and Aristotelianism than the others. In 1933, it seems beyond doubt that if any single semantic characteristic could be selected to account for the primitive state of the individuals and the societies, we could say, without making too great a mistake, that it would be found in identification, understood in the more general sense as it is used in the present work. There is very little doubt at present that our different physico-chemical factors, environment, climate, kind of food, colloidal behavior, endocrine secretions, are fundamental factors which condition the potentialities as well as the behavior of an organism. It is equally certain that as an end result, these physico-chemical factors are connected with definite types of semantic reactions. It is known that the reverse is also true, namely that semantic reactions affect colloidal behaviors, endocrine secretions, and metabolism. The exact type of dependence is not known because too little experimenting on humans has been made. The present analysis is conducted from the semantic point of view, and its results, no matter how far-reaching, are limited to this special aspect. Simple analysis shows that identification is a necessary condition which underlies the reactions of animals, of infants, and of primitives. If found in civilized grown-ups, it equally indicates some remains of earlier periods of development and can always be found in the analysis of any private or public difficulties which prevent any satisfactory solution. Identification, in a slightly modified form, represents also the very foundation of the Aristotelian system and those institutions which are founded on this system. Mathematics gives us practically the only linguistic system free from pathological identifications, although mathematicians use this term uncritically. The more identification is eliminated from other sciences, the more the mathematical functional semantics and methods are applied, and the further a given science progresses. The best we know in 1933 is that the general structure of the world was not different in prehistoric times from what we find it today. We have no doubt that the materials in great antiquity consisted of molecules, molecules of atoms, and atoms of electrons and protons, or whatever else we shall be able to discover someday. We have no doubt that blood was circulating in the higher animals and humans, that vitamins exhibited very small characteristics as today, that different forms of radiant energy influenced colloidal behavior, regardless of whether or not the given animal, primitive man, or infant knew or knows about them. How about the primitive physical needs and wants of an animal, a primitive man, and an infant? Besides all mystical and mythological reasons for identification, the structural facts of life necessitated identification on this level of development. Without modern knowledge, what a hungry animal, primitive man, or an infant wants is an object, say, called an apple. He would define his apple the best he could as to shape, color, smell, taste. Was this what his organism needed? Obviously not. We could at present produce an undigestible synthetic apple which would satisfy his eventual objective definitions. He might eat it, many such apples, and eventually die of hunger. Is an abundant and pleasant diet free from unsuspecting and unseen vitamins satisfactory for survival? Again, no. Thus, we see clearly that what the organism needed for survival were the physico-chemical processes not found in the ordinary object, but exclusively in the scientific object or the event. Here we find the age-old and necessary, on this early level, identification of the ordinary object with the scientific object. This form of identification is extremely common, even in 1933, and to a large extent responsible for our low development, because no matter what we think or feel about an object represents only an abstraction of a low order, only a general symbol for the scientific object, which remains the only possible survival concern for the organism. But obviously, such identification, being false to facts, can never be entirely reliable. If anyone fancies that he deals with an ultimate reality, yet the multi-ordinal reality represents only a shadow cast by the scientific object, he begins with experience to distrust the object and populates his world with delusional mysticism and mythologies to account for the mysteries of the shadow. As any organism represents an abstracting in different orders process, which again, the animal, the primitive man, and the infant cannot know, they by necessity identify different orders of abstractions. Thus, names are identified with the unspeakable objects, names for actions with the unspeakable action itself, names for a feeling with the unspeakable feelings themselves. By confusing descriptions with inferences and descriptive words with inferential words, the judgments, opinions, beliefs, and similar semantic reactions, which represent mostly, if not exclusively, inferential semantic end products, are projected with varying pathological intensity on the outside world. By this method, pre-logical primitive semantic attitudes were built. Mere similarities were evaluated as identities. Primitive syllogisms were built of this type. Stages run fast. Some Indians run fast. Some Indians are stags run fast. Some Indians run fast. Some Indians are stags. It is common to find among primitive peoples a kind of logic based on the post hoc ergo propter hoc, after this and therefore because of this fallacy, which obviously represents an identification of an ordinal description with an inference. The question-begging epithets, which exercise a tremendous semantic influence on primitive and immature peoples and represent a semantic factor in many primitive as well as modern taboos, are only based on such confusions of orders of abstractions. Identification is one of the primitive characteristics which cannot be eliminated from the animal or the infant because we have no means to communicate with them properly. It cannot be eliminated from primitive peoples as long as they preserve their languages and environments. Identification is extremely widespread among ourselves, embodied strongly in the structure of our inherited language and systems. To change that primitive state of affairs, we need special simple means, such as a non-Aristotelian system may offer, to combat effectively this serious menace to our semantic reaction. It should never be forgotten that identification is practically never dangerous in the animal world because unaided nature plays no tricks on animals, and that the elimination by non-survival is very sharp. It is dangerous in the primitive stage of man, however, as it prevents the primitive man to become more civilized, but under his primitive conditions of life, his dangers are not so acute. It becomes only very dangerous to the infant if not taken care of, and to the modern white man in the midst of a very far advanced industrial system which affects all phases of his life, when his semantic reactions are left unchanged from the ages gone by and still remain on the infantile level. The present non-Aristotelian system is not only based on the complete rejection of the is of identity, but every important term which has been introduced here, as well as the structural differential, is aimed at the elimination of these relics of the animal, the primitive man and the infant in us. Thus, the primitive mentality does not differentiate relations enough. To counteract this, I introduce the structural differential. The primitive identities, I introduce a system based on the denial of the is of identity all through. The primitive man pays most attention to what is conveyed to him through the eye and the ear. I introduce the structural differential, which indicates to the eye the stratification of human knowledge, which represents to the eye the verbal denial of the is of identity. If we identify, we do not differentiate. If we differentiate, we cannot identify, hence the structural differential. The terms used also convey similar processes. Once we have order, we differentiate and have orders of abstractions. Once we abstract, we eliminate allness, the semantic foundation for identification. Once we abstract in different orders, and so we order abolishing fanciful infinities. Once we differentiate, differentiation becomes the denial of identity. Once we discriminate between the objective and verbal levels, we learn silence on the unspeakable objective levels, and so introduce a most beneficial neurological delay, engage the cortex to perform its natural function. Once we discriminate between the objective and verbal levels, structure becomes the only link between the two worlds. This results in search for similarity of structure and relations, which introduces the aggregate feeling, and the individual becomes a social being. Once we differentiate, we discriminate between descriptions and inferences. Once we discriminate, we consider descriptions separately, and so are led to observe the facts, and only from description of facts do we tentatively form inferences. Finally, the consciousness of abstracting introduces the general and permanent differentiation between orders of abstractions, introducing the ordering and so stratifications, and abolishes for good the primitive or infantile identifications. The semantic passing from the primitive man or infantile state to the adult period becomes a semantic accomplished fact. It should be noticed that these results are accomplished by starting with primitive means, the use of the simplest terms such as this is not this, and by the direct appeal to the primitive main receptors, the eye and the ear. The elimination of the is of identity appears as a serious task because the Aristotelian system and logic by which we regulate our lives and the influence of which has been eliminated only partially from science represent only a very scholarly formulation of the restricted primitive identification. Thus, we usually assume, following Aristotelian disciplines, that the is of identity is fundamental for the laws of thought, which have been formulated as follows. 1. The law of identity, whatever is. 2. The law of contradiction, nothing can both be and not be. 3. The law of excluded middle, Everything must either be or not be. It is impossible, short of a volume, to revise this logic and to formulate a non-Aristotelian, infinite, valued, non-elementalistic semantics which would be structurally similar to the world and our nervous system, but it must be mentioned even here that the law of identity is never applicable to processes. The law of excluded middle, or excluded third, as it is sometimes called, which gives the two-valued character to Aristotelian logic, establishes as a general principle what represents only a limiting case, and so as a general principle must be unsatisfactory. As on the objective, unspeakable levels, we deal exclusively with absolute individuals and individual situations, in the sense that they are not identical. All statements which by necessity represent higher order abstractions must only represent probable statements. Thus we are led to the infinitely valued semantics of probability, which introduces an inherent and general principle of uncertainty. It is true that the above given laws of thought can and have been expressed in other terms with many scholarly interpretations, but fundamentally the semantic state of affairs has not been altered. From a non-elementalistic point of view, it is more expedient to treat the Aristotelian system on a similar footing with the Euclidean system, namely to consider the above laws of thought as postulates which underlie that system and which express the laws of thought of a given epoch and eventually of a race. We know other systems among the primitive peoples which follow other laws, in which identity plays a still more integral part of the system. Such natives reason quite well. Their systems are consistent with their postulates, although these are quite incomprehensible to those who try to apply Aristotelian postulates to them. From this point of view, we should not discuss how true or false the Aristotelian system appears, but we should simply say that at a different epoch, other postulates seem structurally close to our experience and appear more expedient. Such an attitude would not retard so greatly the appearance of new systems, which will supersede the present non-Aristotelian system. In the present system, identification represents a label for the semantic process of inappropriate evaluation on the unspeakable levels, or for such feelings, impulses, tendencies, as in human life we deal with many orders of abstractions. We could say in an ordinal language that identification originates or results in the confusion of orders of abstractions. This conclusion may assume different forms, one represented by the identification of the scientific object or the event with the ordinary object, which may be called ignorance, pathological to man; another, the identification of the objective levels with the verbal levels, which I call objectification; a third, the identification of descriptions with inferences, which I call confusion, of higher order abstractions. In the latter case, we shall notice that inferences involve usually more intense semantic components such as opinions, beliefs, wishes, than descriptions. These inferences may have a definite objective unspeakable character and may represent then a semantic state which is not words, and so objectifications of higher order may be produced. When we introduce the ordinal language, we should notice that under known conditions, we deal with an ordered natural series, namely events first, object next, object first, label next, description first, inferences next. This order expresses the natural importance, giving us the natural base for evaluation, and so for our natural human semantic reaction. If we identify two different orders by necessity, we evaluate them equally, which always involves errors, resulting potentially in semantic shocks. As we deal in life with an established natural order of values, which can be expressed for my purpose by a series decreasing in value, events or scientific objects, ordinary objects, labels, descriptions, inferences, identification results in a very curious semantic situation. Let us assume that scientifically established value of any level could be expressed as 100 and the value of the next as 1. With the consciousness of abstracting, we could not disregard nor identify these values, nor forget that 100 is greater than 1. If we confuse the orders of abstractions, this can be expressed as the identification in value, and we have a semantic equation. 1. 100 equals 100, or 2. 1 equals 1, or any other number, say 350 equals 50. As we deal fundamentally with a natural directed inequality, say 100 is greater than 1, and under some semantic pressure want, wishful thinking, or ignorance, or lack of consciousness of abstracting, or mental illness, we identified the 2 in value. We produce in the first and third cases an over-evaluation on the right-hand side, and in the second and third cases an under-evaluation on the left-hand side. Thus, on the semantic level, any identification of essentially different in value different orders of abstractions appear as the reversal of the natural order of evaluation with different degrees of intensity. If the natural order of scientific evaluation would be 100 is greater than 1, and we would evaluate through identification as 2 equals 2, or 3 equals 3, 50 equals 50, or 100 equals 100, we would be ascribing twice, or 3 times, or 50 times, or 100 times more delusional values to the right-hand side and under-evaluate the left-hand side than the natural order of evaluation would require. Nature exhibits, in my language and in this field, an asymmetrical relation of more or less inaccessible to Aristotelian procedure. Under the influence of Aristotelianism, when through identification we ascribe to nature delusional values, adjustment becomes very difficult, particularly under modern complex life conditions. The above example indicates the degree of intensity which we find in life in the reversal of the natural order of evaluation through identification produced by and resulting in the lack of consciousness of abstracting. Sanity, which affects practically all of us, represents the reversal of lesser intensity, the reversal of greater intensity, the more advanced mental ills. We should realize that experimentally we find in this field a fundamental difference in value, which on semantic levels can be expressed as an asymmetrical relation of more or less, establishing some natural order. If anyone should claim a natural identity, the burden of proof falls on him. If absolute sameness in all respects cannot be found in this world, then such a notion appears to be false to facts, and becomes a structural falsification preventing sanity and adjustment. If he accepts the fundamental natural difference in value, but prefers to assume a different order of evaluation depending on his metaphysics, be it the elementalistic materialism or equally elementalistic idealism, the semantic results are not changed because identification in the second case would also ascribe delusional identity to essentially different orders of abstractions. It should be noticed that the non-Aristotelian formulation applies equally to the order different opposite doctrines and renders them illegitimate on similar grounds. The status of the event or the scientific object is slightly more complex because the event is described at each date by very reliable, constantly revised and tested hypothetical structural and differential terms, exhibiting the peculiar circularity of human knowledge. If we should treat these inferential structures not as hypothetical but should identify them semantically with the eventual processes on the level of the sub-microscopic event, we would have semantic disturbances of identification. I have selected the above given order not only for convenience and simplicity but because of its experimental character. When we identify in values, we always exhibit in our semantic reaction the reverse natural order introduced here on space-time structural and evaluational grounds. The above analysis represents a very rough outline, but is sufficient for my purpose. Any attentive and informed reader can carry it further as far as desired. The main point appears that different orders of abstractions exhibit different characteristics, and so any identification of entities essentially different in one or more aspects must introduce delusional semantic factors. I speak mostly about evaluation because evaluation appears experimentally as an essential factor in all semantic reactions and can be applied even profitably in those cases of mental illness where no definite evaluation appears. The absence of evaluation being a form of evaluation multi-ordinal. In training, it is of utmost importance to eliminate identification entirely, which invariably appears as a delusional semantic factor. To achieve these ends, all and every available means should be employed. When one studies carefully the older disciplines, one is amazed to learn to what an extent the recorded thinkers rebelled against the limitations and insufficiencies of Aristotelianism, which system naturally became antiquated a short time after its formulation. One is amazed to find that everything has already been said, and that to a large extent these important separated statements were inoperative. It is of little importance that some wise statements had been made by someone somewhere if they had no influence on the great masses of the race. The reason for this tremendous public waste of private efforts is that Aristotelianism, with its further elaborations and its delusional identification elementalism, represents a coordinated system which molded our semantic reactions, languages, and institutions, and which influenced every phase of our lives. Under such conditions, isolated doctrines, no matter how wise, became powerless in the face of such a system, or more correctly, a system of interlocked systems. Only a revision of the system and the tentative formulation of a non-Aristotelian system can make many older fundamental clarifications workable, which, although known to a few specialists, appear generally unknown to the great masses and unavailable in elementary education, which alone can be generally effective. One is also amazed at the power of structurally correct terminology and feels full of sympathy toward the primitive interpretation as the magic of words. Happy, structural, high abstractions really have a strong creative character. Since, for instance, the principle of least action or the general principle of relativity, the theory of the absolute, have been formulated, all of our structural knowledge has been recast, clarified, and we constantly hear of some remarkable applications of the new knowledge. Similarly, if it is pointed out that our main private and public difficulties are due to infantilism produced by Aristotelianism in general and in particular by identification and elementalism, we at once have practical means for a revision and applications. And such a first and novel attempt over subtlety is impossible and even not desirable. It is preferable as well as expedient to formulate the general outline and thereby draw more men into the work for the details. For thousands of years, millions upon millions of humans have used a great deal of their nervous energy in worrying upon delusional questions forced upon them by the pernicious is of identity, such as, what is an object? What is life? What is hell? What is heaven? What is space? What is time? And an endless array of such irritants. The answer, based on the human discrimination of orders of abstractions and so proper human evaluation, is definite, undeniable, simple, and unique. Whatever one might say something is, it is not. Whatever we might say belongs to the verbal level and not to the unspeakable objective levels. Let me repeat once more that the is of identity forces us into semantic disturbances of wrong evaluation. We establish, for instance, the identity of the unspeakable objective level with words which once stated becomes obviously false to facts. The is of identity is used as indicating identity, structurally impossible on the objective levels, says nothing. Thus, the question, what is an object, may be answered, an object is an object, a statement which says nothing. If used in definitions or classifications such as Smith is a man, a type of statement used even in the Principia Mathematica, or A is B or not B, as in the formulation of the law of the excluded third, in the two-valued Aristotelian logic, it always establishes an identity, false to facts. The first statement expresses the identity of a proper name with a class name, which must lead to the confusion of classes. Higher order abstractions with individuals, lower order abstractions. This confusion leads automatically to disturbed evaluation in life because the characteristics of a class are not the same as nor identical with the characteristics of the individual. I shall not analyze in detail the A is B because obviously it is not. How about Fido? Fido has no science and therefore no event. For him, the object is not an abstraction of some order, but is all he knows and cares about. Smith not only abstracts in indefinite numbers of different orders and does it automatically and habitually, but if he inquires, he may also become conscious of abstracting. Is not all, and this is not this. Now, Fido can never be conscious of abstracting, as his nervous system is incapable of being extended by extraneural means, and this extension appears to be a necessary condition for the acquiring of consciousness of abstracting. Although for Smith, this is not this, as illustrated on the structural differential, for Fido, that diagram would eventually mean this is this, the structure of his world being represented by the single disk OA. Fido cannot be conscious of abstracting. He must identify because he knows nothing of this process, and there is no means of informing him of these relations and structure. If we are not conscious of abstracting, we must identify. In other words, whenever we confuse the different orders of abstractions, unavoidable, if we use the is of identity, we duplicate or copy the animal way of thinking with similar emotional responses. In the following chapters, this tragedy will be explained in detail, and it will be shown that practically all human difficulties involve this semantic factor of copying animals in our nervous reactions and evaluation as a component. A theory which not only throws light on this serious problem, but which also gives means of replacing the old harmful semantic reactions by more beneficial ones, may be useful in spite of various temporary difficulties which are due to the old identity reactions and the lack of familiarity with the new. The old identity reactions are extremely ingrained, particularly with grown-ups. Serious effort and permanent reminders are necessary to overcome them. The structural differential represents such a structural visual reminder, which we should keep constantly before our eyes until the pernicious disturbances of evaluation have been overcome. For Smith, the fundamental evaluation can be expressed in simple and quite primitive language. This is not this. The above, most vital semantic factors of evaluation, indispensable for adjustment and sanity, are conveyed to him whenever he looks at the stratification indicated on the differential. The hanging free strings indicating the non-abstracted characteristics train his semantic reaction to be aware of the non-allness of and the lack of identity between his abstractions. Our old semantic reactions were similar to Fido's. We were never fully conscious of abstracting. Through wrong evaluation, we identified that what is inherently different and longed for, or assumed some impossible allness in our knowings. Practice has shown me, definitely, that to acquire these new reactions of consciousness of abstracting is difficult and requires time and effort to accomplish, in spite of the exceptional, nearly primitive simplicity of the means employed. The silence on the objective level sounds very innocent, yet it is extremely difficult to acquire, as it involves a complete checking of all semantic disturbances, identifications, confusions of orders of abstractions, habitual emotions, preconceived ideas, practically impossible without the use of the objective differential, to which we can point our finger and be silent to begin with. In fact, to disregard this point actually means failure in accomplishing the desired semantic results. At present, as far as experience has gone, the main results were achieved when a given individual had conquered this first simple and obvious semantic obstacle. If the simple rules and conditions given in this present system for abolishing identification are followed persistently in the training with the differential, a complete and very beneficial structural and semantic change in the character and mental capacities of a given individual occurs seemingly all out of proportion with the simplicity of the training. But if we consider the content of all knowledge as uniquely structural, and if the majority of us are semantically tied up, blocked, and antiquated, animalistic, primitive, infant-like, mentally ill, and Aristotelian structure and identity reactions owing to the lack of consciousness of abstracting, which we renounce in toto. By acquiring the consciousness of abstracting, such remarkable transformation becomes intelligible. The publication of the structural differential in separate, conveniently large copies has been forced upon me by experience and by various difficulties found in the re-educating of our semantic reaction, without which the non-Aristotelian adjustment, sanity, and all the desirable results which depend on them are impossible.